Did you know the world was once saved by a single man's decision? It's a story that's rarely told, but its impact echoes through history. Sometimes the fate of millions can rest on the shoulders of just one person. Not a president or a general, but a Soviet submarine officer named Vasily Arkhipov. He wasn't famous, but his actions changed the course of history. In October 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Arkhipov's submarine was cornered by the US Navy. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were at their absolute peak. The Americans dropped depth charges trying to force the sub to surface. The crew inside was terrified, unsure if war had already begun above them. The captain, believing war had started, wanted to launch a nuclear torpedo. The pressure and fear inside that submarine were unimaginable. Launching would have triggered a full-scale nuclear war. The world as we know it could have ended in minutes. The decision required 3 officers' consent. 2 said yes. Arkhipov said no. He stood firm, even as the others argued. He argued against the launch and convinced the captain to surface. His calm reasoning and courage made all the difference. His refusal prevented a catastrophe that could have ended civilization. The world was spared from unimaginable destruction. Arkhipov's name isn't widely known, but his courage kept the world from nuclear winter. He is a true unsung hero of the 20th century. This moment shows how close we came to disaster. The world was just seconds away from a different fate. The Cold War was filled with such moments, when the fate of billions rested on a single choice. Ordinary people everywhere held their breath, hoping for peace. Sometimes history hinges on one voice of reason in chaos. Arkhipov's story reminds us that even in the darkest times, one person's courage can change everything. Let's explore other terrifying moments when the world held its breath, and see how close we've come to the edge of disaster. To understand these crises, we need to see how the Cold War began. The roots of this conflict stretch back to the final days of World War II, when the world was still reeling from devastation and uncertainty. After World War II, the US and Soviet Union, once uneasy allies united against a common enemy, quickly became rivals. Their alliance was always fragile, held together only by the urgent need to defeat Nazi Germany. Their political and economic systems, democracy and capitalism in the West, communism in the East, were fundamentally opposed. Each side believed its way of life was superior and should shape the future of the world. This deep mistrust and ideological divide shaped 4 decades of global politics, influencing decisions in every corner of the globe. The US championed individual freedoms, free markets, and the promise of prosperity. American leaders saw themselves as defenders of democracy, determined to stop the spread of communism. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, controlled everything from the press to the economy, restricting freedoms and allowing only one party. Soviet leaders believed only a strong, centralized state could protect their people and ideals. Each saw the other as a threat to its existence, convinced that the other side wanted to dominate the world. The ideological battle soon became a global competition for influence, with both superpowers vying for allies and strategic advantage. The world split into 2 camps, the Western Bloc led by the US, and the Eastern Bloc led by the Soviets. Europe, once united, was now divided by an Iron Curtain. This standoff was called a Cold War because the superpowers never fought directly but always prepared for it. The threat of nuclear war loomed over every decision. The US feared the spread of communism. The domino theory warned that if one country fell, others would follow, threatening democracy everywhere. The Soviets, haunted by past invasions and destruction, wanted a buffer of friendly states in Eastern Europe to protect themselves from future threats. Both sides' fears fueled a dangerous arms race, with each building ever more powerful weapons in a bid to outdo the other. The stage was set for confrontations that could have ended the world in minutes, with leaders making decisions under unimaginable pressure. The Cold War was not just about ideology, it was about survival, fear, and the constant threat of disaster hanging over everyday life. Every move was a gamble with global consequences, as both sides tried to outmaneuver each other without triggering catastrophe. The world was now locked in a tense, high-stakes standoff, with the fate of millions hanging in the balance and the shadow of the Cold War stretching across generations. The first sign of this division came in 1946, as Europe struggled to recover from the devastation of World War II. Cities lay in ruins, and millions of people faced an uncertain future. That year, Winston Churchill delivered a historic speech declaring that an iron curtain had descended across the continent, separating nations and ideologies. Europe was split in two, the free democratic West and the communist East, controlled by the Soviet Union. This division would shape the lives of millions for decades. The Iron Curtain wasn't a physical wall yet, but a growing barrier of ideology, suspicion, and military might that cut through the continent. The Soviets quickly tightened their grip on Eastern Europe, transforming once liberated nations into satellite states under Moscow's control. Hopes for free elections and self-determination vanished behind this new wall, as borders closed and governments fell in line with Soviet demands. The United States and its allies watched with growing alarm, viewing Soviet actions as aggressive expansion and a threat to democracy everywhere. In response, the US adopted a new strategy: containment. The goal was to stop the spread of communism, not to defeat it outright, but to hold the line. This led to the creation of powerful alliances like NATO, where an attack on one member was considered an attack on all, forging a united front in the West. The world drew its battle lines and the stage was set for a new kind of conflict, one fought with threats, spies, and propaganda as much as with armies. The Iron Curtain soon became a powerful symbol of oppression and division, slicing through cities, families, and entire nations. Families were separated overnight, and freedoms that had been promised in the aftermath of war disappeared in the East. Europe became the central front of the Cold War, a tense and dangerous standoff between two superpowers. A single spark here could ignite a global fire, threatening peace everywhere. The continent was now a powder keg, with both sides stockpiling weapons and preparing for the worst. The Cold War's front lines ran through the very heart of Europe, shaping the world for generations to come. The first major Cold War crisis erupted in Berlin. After War, Germany and Berlin were divided among the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. West Berlin became a democratic island deep inside communist East Germany. In 1948, the Western Allies introduced a new currency, angering the Soviets. The Soviets responded by blockading West Berlin, cutting off all supplies. Over 2 million people were trapped. The US faced a choice fight: abandon the city or find another way. President Truman chose the Berlin airlift, supplying the city entirely by air. For nearly a year, planes landed every few minutes, bringing food, fuel, and hope. The airlift was a stunning success, showing US commitment to its allies. The Soviets lifted the blockade in 1949, realizing their plan had failed. The crisis proved how dangerous the Cold War could be. Berlin became a symbol of resistance and resolve. The world saw how close it was to disaster. The city's survival was a victory for freedom. Even after the blockade, Berlin remained a flashpoint. West Berlin was a beacon of freedom, and millions fled East Germany through it. By 1961, the East German government was desperate to stop the exodus. In August 1961, soldiers erected a barrier overnight, soon replaced by the Berlin Wall. The wall was more than concrete, it was a fortress of guard towers and minefields. It split families and friends, becoming the Cold War's ugliest symbol. Crossing meant death, guards had orders to shoot, hundreds died trying to escape. The world watched as US and Soviet tanks faced off at Checkpoint Charlie. Tension was so high that a single shot could have started a war. Both sides eventually pulled back, but the wall remained. It was a daily reminder of division and danger. For decades, Berlin embodied the Cold War's human cost. The wall stood as a scar across Europe. The most dangerous Cold War moment came in October 1962. Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, had become a Soviet ally. US spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed on the island. These missiles could strike American cities in minutes. President Kennedy faced an existential threat. Military leaders urged an immediate airstrike and invasion. Kennedy feared this would trigger nuclear war. Instead, he announced a naval quarantine of Cuba and demanded missile removal. The world watched as Soviet ships approached the blockade. Tension was at its peak. One wrong move could mean annihilation. Kennedy's choice of caution over aggression bought precious time. The fate of the world hung in the balance. The crisis was far from over. After Kennedy's announcement, the world teetered on the edge. US forces were at DEFCON 2, one step from nuclear war. An American U-2 plane was shot down over Cuba, escalating the crisis. Military advisors pushed for retaliation. but Kennedy hesitated. Meanwhile, Vasily Arkhipov's submarine crisis unfolded, unknown to leaders. Secret negotiations began between Robert Kennedy and the Soviet ambassador. A deal emerged: the Soviets would remove missiles from Cuba if the US promised not to invade. Privately, the US also agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey. On October 28, Khrushchev announced the missiles would be dismantled. The world stepped back from the brink. Armageddon was avoided by diplomacy and restraint. The crisis showed how close we came to disaster. A single vote for peace changed history. Imagine if Kennedy had ordered an airstrike on Cuba. Soviet commanders in Cuba had authority to use nuclear weapons. Thousands of US soldiers would have died. The US would have struck back. Escalation would have been unstoppable, a full-scale nuclear exchange. Cities across the US, USSR, and Europe would be destroyed in minutes. Hundreds of millions would die in the blasts and firestorms. Nuclear winter would follow. Global temperatures would plummet, crops would fail, and mass starvation would ensue. Civilization as we know it would end. This isn't science fiction, it's based on real scientific models. The concept of mutually assured destruction kept both sides in check. Both knew that launching meant total destruction for all. The Cold War's terrible logic kept the peace. The world survived by understanding there could be no winners. The Cold War ended with the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. The Berlin Wall fell, and Germany was reunified. For a time, the world felt safer. But the lessons of that era remain urgent. The Berlin and Cuban crises show how mistrust and miscommunication can spiral toward catastrophe. Diplomacy and communication, like the secret talks during the missile crisis, were crucial. The red telephone was established so leaders could talk directly in a crisis. Individuals like Vasily Arkhipov remind us that history is shaped by ordinary people's choices. His courage shows that reason and peace can prevail, even in darkness. The world still faces nuclear dangers and high tensions. The Cold War's stories are warnings, not just history. They remind us what's at stake and why we must work for peace. The world once held its breath and exhaled in relief. Let's never forget the lessons from the edge of disaster.